Newfoundland and Labrador played an important role in the development of long-distance air travel. In 1919, it was a popular taking-off point for aviators racing to cross the Atlantic Ocean. It also served as a refueling point for round-the-world attempts in the 1920s. Amelia Earhart also made 2 record-setting flights from Newfoundland in 1928 and 1932. The advent of passenger flight in the 1930s brought the era of pioneering aviation to a close, but it also established the island as a major stopover between Europe and North America. 1919 was a banner year for aviation firsts. In May, the U.S. Navy's NC-4 seaplane made the world's first transatlantic flight, stopping at several locations along the way. And in June, John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown became the first aviators to fly non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean. Newfoundland played a role in both achievements. The first involved the community of Trepassey. It was there that Lieutenant Commander Albert Reid and his crew landed their NC-4 seaplane in May. Their mission was to fly from North America to England, making multiple stopovers for refueling and maintenance along the way. They left New York on May 8th and stopped at Massachusetts, Halifax, Trepassey, the Azores, and Lisbon before finally arriving at Plymouth, England on May 31st. The team was the first to cross the Atlantic Ocean by air. At the same time that the NC-4 was making its historic flight, other aviators were arriving at Newfoundland to compete for another milestone, the first non-stop flight across the Atlantic. This time, the challenge came with a cash prize. In 1913, the owner of London's Daily Mail newspaper offered a £10,000 reward for piloting the first non-stop transatlantic flight between Great Britain and any point in Canada, the United States, or Newfoundland. The competition was suspended during the First World War, but resumed in 1919. Newfoundland was the preferred taking-off point because it was closer to Europe than anywhere else in North America. Prevailing winds also favored a west-to-east voyage. In the spring of 1919, 4 teams arrived on the island to compete for the prize and a place in aviation history. They were British aviators John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown, Australian pilot Harry Hawker and Scottish navigator Kenneth F. Mackenzie-Grieve, British aviators Frederick Raynham and Charles Morgan, and the Handley Page Company Group led by British pilot Mark Kerr. Handley Page was a British aircraft manufacturer. Much work had to be done before any of the aviators could attempt a transatlantic crossing. Newfoundland had no airstrips, so teams had to scout for a suitable taking-off point. Large, flat spaces were ideal, like fields or plateaus. The aviators and mechanics also had to assemble the aircraft, which were shipped to the island in pieces. A series of test flights also had to be made, and poor weather conditions caused more delays. 2 attempts were made on May 18th, but both ended in failure. Hawker and Mackenzie-Grieve took off from a field in Mount Pearl, but engine problems forced them to land in the Atlantic Ocean about 14 hours and 1,700 kilometers later. They were rescued by a Danish freighter, and the Daily Mail gave them a consolation prize of £5,000. A second attempt that same day was even less successful. At about 4 p.m., Raynham and Morgan taxied their plane down a field near Kitty Lake in St. John's. But the uneven terrain impeded their efforts to take off. So did strong winds and the heavy gasoline load needed to cross the Atlantic. The plane lifted into the air for only a few moments before crashing nose down. Raynham walked away with minor injuries, but Morgan lost sight in his left eye. About a month later, Alcock and Brown made their attempt. Early in the afternoon of June 14th, the pair took off from Lester's Field near St. John's. The next 16 hours were harrowing as the aviators flew through dense fog, pelting rain, and severe turbulence. At one point, their Vickers-Vimy biplane unexpectedly plunged towards the ocean before Alcock pulled it up to safety. Finally, at about 8:40 the following morning, the pair reached County Galway in Ireland. They landed in what they had hoped was a field, but what turned out to be a bog. The soft ground made for a rough landing, and the plane flipped onto its nose shortly after impact. Fortunately, the two aviators were unharmed. Alcock reportedly joked to onlookers, saying that if we had a shave and a bath, we should be all right. Alcock and Brown received the Daily Mail Prize for completing the world's first non-stop transatlantic flight, and they were knighted by King George V. In 1924, a team of aviators with the United States Army Air Services made the first round-the-world flights. Their journey lasted 175 days and included several stops, including ones at Newfoundland and Labrador. The team originally consisted of 4 planes, which departed Seattle, Washington on April 6th, but 2 never completed the trip. One crashed into a mountain while flying through fog on April 30th, and the other sank into the North Atlantic after losing oil pressure. Both crews survived. The remaining 2 planes, named the New Orleans and Chicago, stopped at Icy Tickle, Labrador on August 31st and at Hawke's Bay, Newfoundland on September 2nd, before successfully completing their journey on September 28, 1924. The island of Newfoundland continued to play an important role in future circumnavigation attempts. In 1927, aviation experts identified Harbour Grace as a potential refueling point for round-the-world flights. The community launched a fundraising campaign to build an airstrip, and the Newfoundland government contributed about $14,000. The inaugural flight was made on August 27, 1927, when Americans Edward Schley and William Brock took off in an aircraft named the Pride of Detroit. The pair was trying to break the record for the fastest round-the-world trip, but their circumnavigation attempt ended in failure after an engine defect grounded the plane at Tokyo on September 11th. American pilot Wiley Post and Australian navigator Harold Gatty were more successful in 1931 when they flew their Lockheed Vega, named the Winnie Mae, around the world in record-setting time, 8 days, 15 hours, and 51 minutes. The 25,000-kilometer voyage began on June 23rd at Long Island, New York, and took the pair to several stopover points, including Harbour Grace. Newfoundland played a role in 2 of Amelia Earhart's historic flights. On June 17, 1928, she became the first woman to cross the Atlantic Ocean in an airplane traveling from Trepassey, Newfoundland to Bury Point, Wales. Earhart made the journey as a passenger on board an aircraft named Friendship. It was piloted by Wilmer Stultz and Lewis Gordon. They made the crossing in 20 hours and 40 minutes. In 1932, Earhart piloted the world's first solo transatlantic flight by a woman. Only one other person in history had flown a plane solo across the Atlantic Ocean. It was Charles Lindbergh, who flew from Long Island, New York to Paris, France in 1927. 5 years later, Amelia Earhart selected Harbour Grace, Newfoundland as her starting point. A crowd of well-wishers came out to watch her take off on May 20, 1932. As she piloted her red Lockheed Vega above the Atlantic Ocean, Earhart had to contend with harsh weather. Thick fog forced her to occasionally fly blind, powerful winds battered the aircraft, and ice formed on the wings. Mechanical problems created other dangers. Just 4 hours after leaving Newfoundland, Earhart spotted flames shooting from an exhaust pipe. Not long after that, she discovered that her gasoline tank was leaking. Finally, after about 15 hours in the air, she landed in a pasture in Northern Ireland. A farmer named Dan McCallion watched the descent. When Earhart exited the plane, he asked her if she had flown a far distance. "From America," was her now famous reply. 2 months later, the American government awarded her the Distinguished Flying Cross. By then, the pioneering phase of transatlantic flight was nearing its end. Technological advances had made aircraft, meteorology, and wireless communications more sophisticated and reliable than in the past. As long-distance flight became increasingly safe, government and industry established regular passenger and mail air services. In the 1930s, the island of Newfoundland became a western terminus for commercial transatlantic air service. Airports opened at Botwood and Gander, and by 1938, regular weekly flights linked North America and Europe. The Second World War sparked even greater advances as the Canadian and American armed forces expanded the island's existing airports and built new ones at Goose Bay, Argentia, Stephenville, and Torbay.